now, let's see. Are you seeing me now in presentation view?
Yes.
Terrific. Great. My name is Matthew Lange. I lead a group called IC Foods, which is the International Center for Food Ontology, Operability, Data, and Semantics, which is kind of a mouthful. IC Foods, our mission is to build standards and cyber infrastructure for this emerging Internet of Food. What is the Internet of Food? Well, it's really all of the data on the internet about food. And it can emerge from lots of different places. It can emerge from Internet of Things devices. It can emerge from questionnaires and forms. It can emerge from economic data, transportation data, what have you, right? So how do we cohere all of these into essentially an internet? And as you might think, this group especially being ontologists, semantic web plays a big part of that. So the SWOF, or the semantic web of food, how can we begin to ask and answer questions upstream and downstream of the food value chain that we can't currently ask and answer right now? That is our mission as an organization, and for myself as an individual, essentially my life's work. So what does that cyber infrastructure look like, and why do we want to do it? Well, we want to do it because we want to democratize food and health. And I'll get into what that means in a minute. But first, let's start with something that I think is perhaps a little bit more tangible, a concept of a smart food system or a smart food shed. So can we answer questions as a community? What do we eat? Where does it come from? What do we produce? Where does it go? Who's involved in those processes? What resources do they produce, move, or transport? Who's not involved and why? And what gets wasted along the way? What are the emissions and effluents that will affect environmental outcomes? And so one of the things that we can think about doing as we think about ontology is really a process of stakeholder engagement in order to form a shared conceptualization, which is really the foundation of ontology, going back previous to computational ontology, but from a philosophical perspective. So how do we take that shared conceptualization, and how do we do that across energy and environment, making land use decisions, deciding what to grow and how to grow it, how to process that food, what happens when certain populations eat certain things, and what are the health outcomes. Again, we have lots of places where we can query this kind of data, lots of ways of querying it, acquiring it, quantifying it. And we have lots of endpoints that we can think about in terms of research, education, innovation, recommendation, and ultimately personalization. What is the right food for me to eat under my condition? As it happens, I have a rare connective tissue disorder. So how does that change my diet? So this is the original slide that we used to found IC Foods within UC Davis. So this was the original grant, essentially, and that was a 3-year grant to design a center for the Internet of Food, and that the plan for that was to spin that out after 3 years. That was in 2016. In 2019, we spun out, and we are now a standalone 501c3 research organization, and we receive funding from multiple agencies. We are a grant-driven organization. So our mission is not just to build the Internet of Food. Our mission is really to democratize food systems via digitization, so that we can improve security, sustainability, and resiliency, access and equity, robustness and healthfulness, productivity and efficiency. We want to make the food system more transparent so that we can understand stakeholder issues and desires, indicators of their success, and trade-offs. This is really important. It's not enough to say we're going to make the production of X commodity more climate friendly if it raises the price of that commodity to a point where people are going hungry. So really, what we can do, though, is we can lower barriers to innovation. We can collapse the time it takes to go from acquiring information to having an idea to innovating and even to implementing across science, practice, policy, and technology. So how do we enable more people to participate? That's the democratization component, right? So we want to improve both the number and variety of actors in the food systems, as well as the number and variety of foods in the food system. We want to improve traceability, transparency, trust. Our trust in what we're eating is what people say it is. And we want people to have equity and access. It's not okay that some members of our society spend their days essentially preparing or picking food for the rest of the population, and yet themselves are food insecure. And how do we enable data-driven policy and interventions as opposed to policy that's created by a few select individuals in a back room? And this one is really important. How do we preserve knowledge? That is, we hear about the destruction of coral reefs. We hear about the destruction of rainforests. What about the knowledge, the institutional wisdom that our elders have about food that is not necessarily written down anymore? How do we save these stories and know-how about certain foods, about what they're good for, used for, and about what to do with the scraps that we may have lost this knowledge. In fact, we've lost a lot of this knowledge in our industrial-based food systems. And how do we educate people about all of the above? This will require workforce development. Right, so the digitization process really is about ontology, language and classification systems, but also about building cyber infrastructure, data harvesting, generation, API aggregation, of course, machine learning and AI, interface development, both conversational and visual, and of course, robotics, sensors, actuators, all kinds of automation. Again, traceability, transparency, trust. This is what digitization allows us to do and that we can't currently do. And again, the data-driven science. So if we just look at a picture of food and a market here in a traditional market, and we see there's a lot happening here in this market, right? We've got a consumer aspects about that we care about relative to the food, their standard of living, health, income, right? We've got business aspects. We've got regulatory aspects, just to name a few, farming aspects, and equity, right? So I'm talking to a group of ontologists right now. I would hazard to guess that more than 50% of you have seen this cartoon. It's one of my favorites. The question is how do we develop a new standard that that is not just one of another competing standard? And ontology actually provides us a way to do that by virtue of having synonymy and by virtue of having not one term, but one identifier that we can then link terms to, labels to. Let's just call them labels. So we've taken some early cracks at this about food systems. And one of the ways that we can prevent this competing standards here is one of the first slides I had up, which was continuous stakeholder engagement to develop that shared conceptualization. So in other words, in this situation here on this cartoon, how could we get these 14 groups to come together and talk about their shared conceptualization? The other way to do it is to, of course, look at sources. This is work that's been done by Patrick Huber at the Food Systems Lab, and he's a longtime collaborator with IC Foods. So what we've done here is, sorry, I thought I had the title of this. We've built a vocabulary of sustainability issues and indicators. And what we've done is we've sourced these from a variety of global initiatives. So again, a shared conceptualization. We've sourced them from corporate sustainability reports, and we've sourced them from livelihood academic literature about livelihoods to begin to shape up sustainability issues and indicators. And so here's a list of the integrated issues and indicators, just the types of things that are covered in our vocabulary here. It's not a formal ontology yet, but this is something that we can use to tag food system actors about the types of integrated issues that might befall them or that they might be working on specifically in the food system. And then linking these with specific outcomes. So this is the work, sustainability vocabularies. You can check it out here if you have an interest. But basically, once we have these vocabularies of issues and indicators, we can begin to develop impact frameworks around the impact that specific interventions may have on addressing these. And we can also develop a vulnerability framework. What are the possible points of failure within a food system? We certainly saw this happen a lot in COVID, and now we're seeing it happen with Ukraine. And this is just a graphic of the red dots there are integrated issues as nodes. The blue dots are the component issues, and the green dots are the indicators linking essentially the metrics to the issues. So what this means really is that we can we have these issues and indicators for specific food system actors at an organizational level. But we also can begin to annotate not just these food system actors, but all the way down essentially to the molecular level. So if we just look at this example, we can think of a field from a point of view of what that piece of land might be used for, land use decision making. We can think about what's going to be growing in that field, what we get from that crop, what we transform it into, and then ultimately what we eat. And if we were to continue this from the food perspective, we would ingest it, and it would then affect our personal phenotypes. So perhaps you haven't previously thought of the idea that your lasagna has a phenotype, but I would argue that it does. It has a primary, secondary, and tertiary structures, and indeed these are affected by the molecular components. So here's an example of an ontology of food processing that we've begun building. It's not yet published. This is something that we're just beginning to build. But you can see here that the hierarchies are very important. So decorticating process is just removing the outer layer of something. This was in consultation with a number of food engineers, colleagues of mine at UC Davis. And we can begin to characterize also the sensory experience. It's not accurate to say that healthy food is necessarily divergent from tasty food. So what does it look like to be able to compute over sensory outcomes while we're also computing over nutritional outcomes? And similarly, we can begin to use things like NAICS codes and SIC codes, industry classification codes, to begin to build ontologies about food systems actors. This is an ontology about the food production industry. We also have something similar around the food processing industry. And we also have a burgeoning vocabulary around allied industries related to food processing. So in this case, you're seeing a graphic here of makers of machinery for making food, because these are also food system actors. Just to highlight a little bit further, this is a recent paper. It's still under review. I've highlighted Hande's and my names there. Note that we are co-authors on this paper, and this is really about the ontologies about food that are in the OBO Foundry, the Open Biological Ontologies Foundry. So you can see here that we've got, a variety of groups, ontologies for nutritional studies, medical action, biomarkers, compositional dietary nutrition ontology, etc. I'll highlight a few of them. So this is an excerpt from the compositional dietary nutrition ontology and what it looks like to be able to relate components of foods to the CHEBI, chemical entities of biological interest, ontology. This is an example from the disease ontology, and linking it to food allergies. Here's another example of the nutrition intervention hierarchy within the medical action ontology. And I'll just pause here for a minute. And since a number of you are from NIH, posit that food, nutrition, and health, one of our goals, my personal goal, is to make food, nutrition, and health informatics infrastructure first-class citizens inside of the NIH at the same degree as diseases, drugs, and diagnoses. If we think about the long-term food system problems we have, the rates of non-infectious chronic diseases that are essentially disabling our population, we are not going to drug and cut our way out of that problem. We need to begin taking seriously dietary and nutrition interventions and elevate them with the same level of funding and commitment that we do essentially for diseases, diagnoses, and drugs. But we can't wait until a disease happens with food because it takes a long time. So we need to be thinking about health as opposed to disease. So here's another example of modeling a vegan diet, food products in the ONS, what is the ontology for nutritional studies, so that we can begin to relate all kinds of nutritional studies together and compare results. One of the heavy lifters in Food On, of course, is Damien Dooley. He was the first author on that previous article and the first author on the Food On article. This is the original paper for Food On, which is the food ontology. I'm here in the middle as well. And I think you'll see, I don't see, there's Pierre Luigi. He's on the next page. And Chris Mungal was also a big part of this, although I guess he didn't make it onto the paper. But this idea that we can develop designing assets around ontologies around foods. I think I'm just about running out of time, so I'm just going to skip past that. Here is the Sustainability Development Goals ontology that we can begin to relate to the systems issues and indicators, and that I had mentioned before, sustainability issues and indicators. some more ontologies that are in the food-on ecosystem. And then we have other groups like this group at ESIP-Fed, who's doing Earth observation data. And I note that they're capturing this information about food, but yet they're not using any kind of food-on ontology or any ontology. They're just using plain descriptors here. So it would be nice to begin since this is a multi-agency talk, to begin to see harmonization across agencies, so that we can begin to come together and, again, ask and answer upstream and downstream questions by virtue of having interoperable data. One way we're addressing this is a graduate student that I'm advising at the University of Milan. He is an IC Foods fellow, and he is building a meta framework for plugging in all of these various ontologies into foods, about foods, and into food systems. Courtney Riggle is a co-founder of IC Foods, and she is working on standardizing pack sizes such that we can literally compare apples to apples at food hubs and varieties of places. And we're part of Icicle AI, which is a new NSF AI institute devoted to cyber infrastructure and for making that cyber infrastructure available in order to democratize AI, to bring AI to people who would not otherwise have access to AI, in the same way that we can bring electricity or the internet. One does not need to know HTML in order to use the internet. One should not have to know a ton or be able to write code about AI in order to use AI. And indeed, we're seeing this with ChatGPT, but we think we can do this in a little bit more of an open fashion, such that we understand where results are coming from. You'll see Smart Food Sheds here at the top is one of our use-inspired science cases. I'm one of the leaders of that group and leaders of the ontology and knowledge graph group, excuse me, that's inside of the AI initiative. One of the outcomes from Icicle is this interactive analytics, visual analytics of knowledge graphs, and we will be plugging in a voice query component in our next release. This release is coming out in April.
I made David host. I'm about to jump off here.
Are you? Sorry. I'm sorry. Okay. I think I'm getting somebody else's words coming through. Okay, so this is some of the reusable cyber infrastructure that we're building. This will write Sparkle queries for you based on filtering in a table, or circling nodes in a graph, or circling nodes on a map, such that it will automatically generate Sparkle. These are some of our partners at Icicle that we are building these components with. And I would just like to thank my team at IC Foods, including Courtney Riggle, and I think we have Troy Rimping on the call here as well, and graduate students, Emily Steliotis, and I think I already mentioned Georgia Ubiali. So with that, I will stop here and hand it over to Asiya and my colleague Hande.
Yeah, do you have any questions to ask? If not, we can hand over to Hande and we can ask